Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here talking to everyone. I would like to talk to you today about my experience in this line of work, working in strategy, monitoring the execution and assisting the implementation of strategy. And basically I'll be sharing some thoughts and observations from these projects. And I would like to start by asking what is the most important question that faces teams in practice working on strategy. And that is not what is strategy. That's an interesting but not a useful question. The key question that we often face in projects is, who is responsible for strategy? This is a very important question, and it breaks down into three questions. Who makes the strategy? Who implements the strategy? And who is going to monitor the strategy? So let's look at this from an activities point of view. And the activities that we have here in a strategy project are to define the strategy, basically, and to implement it and then to monitor it. And we often look at this dynamic as a top-down situation where the definition basically drives the implementation, defines what needs to be implemented. The definition also defines what needs to be monitored and consequently how. And there's very little interaction between the implementation and the monitoring activities. This is a silo situation. And back to the question of who, the roles, the economic theory has an explanation or a point of view about this question, and it puts this in the terms of principal-agent duality. If you remember from your studies in economics, the principal is the entity or person who has the interest in the enterprise, the owner, the CEO, the board. And the agent is the person or the persons or the stakeholders who are acting on behalf of the principal, executing his or her will. And usually this is management. And there's this interaction, this push and pull interaction between the principal and the agent. And the economic theory goes into great length explaining what happens in this direction. And now you have the monitor who sits somewhere between the two, and we ask ourselves, is the monitor on the side of the principal? Is he part of the principal, or is the monitor an agent? Is the monitor an agent for the principal, or can the monitor collaborate with the agent management as an observer? Are you allowed to interact with management, and to which extent? And I would like to stop here because this is not useful. Absolutely not. In real life, these theories, I believe, are not very helpful, certainly not constructive. And I would like to take a different approach to look at this problem, which is to look at it again from the relations between these activities in a more objective way before we look at the roles. And what we see from practice is that there is certainly no top-down relationship. There is always bidirectional interaction between every element of a strategy project. The definition affects the implementation greatly by its nature, but also the implementation feeds back and affects the definition. So there is a cyclical feedback relationship. The same thing happens on the monitoring side. The definition sets the ground for the monitoring, but also monitoring influences the design and the thinking of the strategy. And also the monitoring and implementation are greatly interlinked. So the way I see it is that it's a system of interdependencies between these activities. And hence the actors who are acting in these circles are by nature interdependent. And if this still doesn't make sense to you, I would like to motivate this by talking about change. And here, what comes to mind is a saying by Helmut von Moltke, who was a German army general in the 19th century, along with Bismarck and von Roon, are responsible for creation of the German state. And von Moltke said that no plan survives contact with the enemy. He said it in a more sophisticated and German way, but essentially this is the idea. And perhaps it is expressed more simply by another fighter, Mike Tyson, who said everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And so what these people are trying to say is not that planning is not useful. Absolutely not. But what they're saying is that planning essentially is an exercise in dealing with uncertainty. That's all it is. And by this definition, it's impossible to know the results of a plan. And this dictates the need for the plan as you go. So in the beginning, you set your course for the beginning of the journey, and then it has to adapt. What does it mean in the corporate world? Normally, the strategy, the plan, is composed of a set of components, elements, projects, initiatives, operational directives, and these break down into KPIs, measurable components that we have to monitor. And this system in motion is all interrelated. So what you have in reality is that there is different forms of resistance at all levels. And if these levels are not geared for feedback, what you'll have is at the smallest circle, at the KPIs, when you're starting to encounter resistance, implementing the smallest parts of the strategy. If this is not fed back into the system, and if this resistance is too great, is impossible to, for example, unachievable, then what you will have is grinding of the gears, and the gears will start to break. And as the smaller gears start to break down, then the bigger gears start to break down. I would like to ask one of the participants has the mic on, if you could please mute yourself. So basically, the plan is to change. Make sure that your plan is going to be adaptable, and this is at all levels, at the strategy, at the projects, and the KPIs. Just to give, to reflect on the recent past, any strategy before the blockade in Qatar is not the same as after the blockade. Everything changed. And from the more recent history, some of us may remember vaguely some things that happened in 2020 that are forcing us to change our strategies. So it's all in flux. Everything has to be adaptable. At this point, I will leave theory behind and start reflecting on some practical points from practice, and I'll talk about data collection. We have found that it takes a lot of time to collect the data and is relatively complex because monitoring a strategy, you're looking into different kinds of indicators, lots of different types of data from a lot of people, and this can get out of hand really quickly. One of the best ways to manage the collection process, which has to be cyclical, whether it's yearly or quarterly, as it often is, or even monthly, is that you need to have a very clear and easy to use system in place to interact. So what we have done here is we created a task management system where each requirement for information is a card on the system, and we put everything we need on that card. We assign the card to a person with a due date, and we manage the work of these cards. And we have 50 or 70 or 100 cards. Everything is here, everything is easily managed. And this all takes us back to the point of being able to change quickly. A system that is flexible and organized is a system that can change. By virtue of this organization, you are able to produce reports at a the click of the button, and at any point in time answer questions about where we are with this quarter or with this year's strategy monitoring, who's behind regarding the data collection and so on. I would also like to point your attention to the absolute importance of exploring ways to collect data automatically. Of course, some data has to be manual, but there are a lot of opportunities today to obtain data from the organization in an automated or semi-automated way. Tap into your IT systems, use survey tools internally, externally, and look into certain artificial intelligence techniques such as language processing or perhaps task monitoring, which is simply the screen capture of employees' activities. There are technologies today that collect data and use clustering algorithms to identify trends, patterns, aspects of importance that can in some cases be used to create this type of performance reporting very, very efficiently. Look into robotic process automation and other tools. Once the data is collected, it is important to be able to compile that data and present it, but keep in mind that it's not just one audience. You have different audiences. You have top management, of course, the CEO, the executives, the board. You also have the managers who need to know what is being reported, where are they excelling, where are they having difficulties, what is the problem. This is a feedback, a cyclical process. Perhaps employees. So keep in mind that the reporting has to have different levels of granularity, and different stakeholders at different levels need different level of detail and different way of presentation without losing the consistency. A person looking at a report for top management, the CEO, for example, who happens to look at an operational report should see the same conventions, understand the data in the same way, even though it is more detailed. So consistency is key. What we found to be a non-obvious but very important factor in creating the motivation for implementation of the strategy is the way it is linked together, the way that KPIs are linked to initiatives, and the way that initiatives are linked back to the strategy. And as an observer, it is on you to decide how you're going to represent these figures, how you're going to sum up this performance in more and more aggregate, and what techniques you use make big changes in the end result. So this is a very careful balance between accuracy and usefulness, something that needs to be taken into consideration. This is an example of some recent work that we have done, myself and my team. This is a strategy report. On the middle top, we have the overall performance of the strategy. Below that, we have the breakdown into different sectors or different segments. We also have the time dimension as it progresses over the periods. This takes us into more breakdown where we see the strategy on the left, on the right side. Then we see the same tenets or goals, and we start breaking down the tenets into initiatives, into projects, down to the KPI level, which we can then drill into and see in full detail down to the line item, which is behind this graph. So this is the level of detail that is catering for different participants. Some stakeholders will just need to get a general idea, others will need to troubleshoot it, others will need to dig into detail. Closing, I would like to say that strategy is, as I started, is all about change, being able to change. And the reason we have strategy is to be able to react in an organized way, where fear does not govern. And this was the theory of von Moltke, that for him strategy is a system of options. that you prepare in advance, and you can be sure that the Germans go into great lengths in preparation. They even count the number of nails that they have to take with them on a campaign. But essentially, it's about having the options at the time when you need them ready. And it was mentioned before that COVID-19 is unforeseen. And I agree and disagree with that. It was largely unforeseen, but it was not unforeseeable. As some of you may know, that 5 years ago there were plans for pandemics, and some of these plans were scrapped. Some nations kept this planning capacity and were able to respond to the situation much more quickly and successfully. For example, Germany or Sweden, and some nations not so fast. So it's all about planning and taking risk into consideration, taking not just the known risk, taking the unknown risk, what we couldn't possibly imagine. And that's a very difficult exercise, but it's possible. It's possible to a human extent. The other point I want to make is that strategy is about culture. And I don't mean culture, this nice vase here with the nice drawing. Culture is the culture of the organization. Our habits, our ways of communicating and dealing and handling problems and panicking or not panicking and reacting to issues. It is all ingrained in our in what makes us individuals and companies. And I mention this because the most important motivation to create strategies is not to have 5-year diagrams on the wall. It's a very long period. Whatever you're going to put today for 5 years is not going to be there, for sure. But the intention may be there. The intention may be realized, and that is only possible by changing the soft tissue of the organization, by changing the way we think and we operate. And this is usually the motivation for the CEO to say, okay, I want to have a strategy. Let's change. And essentially, this is not measurable. And this is a huge dilemma for the monitor or the observer, because you have to monitor something observable and measurable, but at the same time, the reason you're doing it is not going to be measurable. The success of the strategy is not the 29%. That is just a number. The success is something very intangible, and if that is missed, we have done nothing. So, and a point on measurement is a quote often attributed to Peter Drucker, which is what gets measured gets done. And this is, I think, a mistake. I don't think Peter Drucker said that, but what we know for sure is that Ridgway said something similar, but it continues. What gets measured gets done, even when it is pointless to measure and to manage, and even if it harms the organization, bless you, to do so. So you have to be extremely careful about what you measure. And in many cases, only you know whether something really needs to be measured or not. And you are the last line of defense before going all in into climbing against the wrong wall. So to close, I would like to reflect on the main question again of strategy. Who is responsible for strategy? And I would say everybody is responsible about strategy. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Marwan, thank you so much. This is extremely insightful. As usual, we get